Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the U.S. mission. I'm Jeff De Laurentiis, the ambassador here for Special Political Affairs, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our special event on Burma this evening. We're pleased to co-sponsor this screening and panel discussion with the Foreign Policy Association. As many of you know, the FPA produces the PBS Great Decisions television series. And the film you're about to see, The Generals and the Democrat, Burma in Transition, is one documentary in that powerful chain. An extraordinary amount has happened regarding Burma over the last few years, including here in New York. For many years, UN member states expressed grave concern over the flawed elections and the regime's continued preference for repression and restriction over inclusion and transparency. Both the Security Council and the General Assembly had been discussing its concerns about violence, political prisoners, and human rights, and calling for a transition to democracy since 2007. Looking back, in a way, it's hard to imagine that we would be holding an event such as this now. Thanks to the initiative of Burmese leaders, things have changed. In November 2011, President Obama first noted, quote, "flickers of progress in Burma after years of darkness," close quote. Since that time, we have all watched the dramatic transition as a dictatorship of 5 decades has loosened its grip. Under President Thein Sein, the desire for change has been met by an agenda for reform. A civilian now leads the government, and a parliament is asserting itself as a forum for genuine democratic debate. The once outlawed National League for Democracy stood in an election, and Aung San Suu Kyi is a member of parliament. Hundreds of prisoners of conscience have been released, and forced labor has been banned. Preliminary ceasefires have been reached with ethnic armies, and new laws allow for a more open economy. As these changes rapidly unfold, the international community, the United Nations, and the United States are entering a new phase in our engagement on behalf of a more democratic and prosperous future for the Burmese people. In fact, President Thein Sein will be in Washington next week. The White House released an announcement today, the first visit of a Burmese leader in more than half a century. We know that the work is far from done, and there are enormous and complex challenges ahead. But we all agree that Burma will not face them alone. Following tonight's screening, our expert panel will offer you a chance to engage directly in the discussion of the country's future. I'd especially like to welcome Patrick Murphy, the U.S. State Department Special Representative and Policy Coordinator for Burma, Francis Swenig, President of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council Institute, and Maureen Ang Thuyn, Director of the Burma Project and the Southwest Asia Initiative at the Open Society Foundations. The panel will be moderated by Barbara Crosset, who wrote the Burma chapter in the Great Decisions 2013 briefing book and is the UN correspondent for the nation. With that, I'd like to turn the mic over to McDara King, the executive producer of the Great Decisions television series. Thank you very much, and I welcome you again.
Thank you, Ambassador De Laurentiis, and thank you to our friends at the U.S. Mission for hosting this evening. For those of you not familiar with the Great Decisions program, it's a component of a much larger discussion program, America's largest and oldest discussion program, Great Decisions. Great Decisions was founded by the FPA in the 1950s in an attempt to better inform and engage Americans in the foreign policy making process. The Great Decisions program consists of a briefing book, this 8-part television series, a teacher's guide, and a opinion ballot. This year, we're starting a new product, which is Great Decisions Middle School Edition. People across the country use these materials to discuss 8 topics, meeting once a week for 8 weeks in churches, community centers, schools, universities, even people's homes. The culminating product of the discussions is the National Opinion Ballot Report, which the FPA produces and sends to Congress and the executive to communicate informed Americans' opinions on these foreign policy issues. For 2013, Great Decisions Television interviewed over 100 experts and policymakers to produce 8 programs designed again to engage Americans in the foreign policy process and hopefully to be a primer for discussion on these issues. Our broadcast reaches about 3 out of 4 U.S. homes, and our viewership is measured in the millions, so we hope to have some impact on the national debate on these issues. I'd like to recognize a few members of the production team who are with us tonight. Producer Robert Nolan, our director Rick Lopes, our chief editor David Heidelberger, and I don't believe he's here yet, but our Academy Award nominated narrator David Strathairn. Hopefully the panel will bring us up to speed on what's happened since we completed filming last year. Thank you.
The long-isolated nation of Burma is shifting toward democracy, a move encouraged by President Obama's visit to the country in late 2012. But how can the U.S. ensure that this emerging South Asian state becomes friend, not foe?
It's really a remarkable story, Burma, of the past year and a half. Maybe the most positive development we've seen globally, really.
This is not a revolution of the people. It's a transformation of a regime, self-motivated to transform.
There have been a number of things that the regime has done that have been very surprising. One was letting Aung San Suu Kyi out of house arrest.
The problem may be the expectations of the people now are too high.
The military is a major wild card in this.
The generals and the Democrat. Burma in transition. Join us as we explore today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions.
Okay, good evening, everyone. We have quite a distinguished panel tonight, and we have, I'm sure, lots of questions in the audience in this neighborhood. There are always people who have a lot they want to talk about. I'm Barbara Crossett, as it says on your piece of paper. I won't go through all of our biographies because you have at least some element of what these people have had in very distinguished years of working with Southeast Asia. And Maureen was born in Burma, so that makes her special. We're going to start, the program will work like this. We're going to start, and it is being videotaped, so it is on the record, right? In any case, we will start with about 7 or 8 minutes from each of the panelists, and then we'll either discuss a little bit among ourselves or turn directly to questions from the audience. We will finish all together by 8 o'clock promptly, so that's the program. We're going to start, I think, most usefully with Patrick Murphy, who can bring all of you up to date to the absolute last minute policy decisions and so on in Washington, and in general talk a little bit about the U.S. and Burma relations, and maybe even explain a little bit about why we still call it Burma in the United States. These next couple of years are going to be very, very important for Burma. These tumultuous changes that have happened, and they weren't tumultuous so much as they were just breathtaking, in the last few years are now going to be followed by equally large challenges. You've heard the ambassador mention some of them. One of them being a general election in 2015, which will elect the president as well as the parliament. And the question is, would Aung San Suu Kyi be a candidate? And most people would say she would win easily, but at the moment she's barred by the Constitution. And to change the Constitution, it has to be amended in Parliament, and Parliament is controlled by the military. So you see where she gets into this circle will be very interesting. Also in 2014, Burma will become the chair of the ASEAN group. This would have been unthinkable 5, 3, 4 years ago. And it really marks its final step into a regional organization that has created so much wealth and development in the region of Southeast Asia. So that will be a huge challenge for the Burmese, because if you've been isolated from the world for a long time, to have to come up with a core of people in the civil service, in the diplomatic service, in all the agencies and ministries who can cope with this responsibility. Because it's not just one set of summit meetings, it goes on and through various kinds of sessions, and also starts before 2014 and the formal handover of the chairmanship of ASEAN. So, and this year we have the ASEAN Games, just to make it, well, that might be a trial run for whether how the Burmese handle a huge influx of outsiders, journalists and officials and so on when their turn comes to lead ASEAN. Okay, so Ambassador Murphy, he is policy coordinator and special representative for Burma in the State Department. And, you know, he's had 20 years off and on of working in Burma and about Burma. So he's going to lead off. And then Frances, who's just got off a plane that was 90 minutes late. I wanted to talk about the economic side of this because she works for the Trade Council. She is the president of the U.S.-ASEAN the Business Council Institute, and she will talk about investment in Burma and some of the new rules, or whatever she feels is something that just brings you up to date. This is really intended to be a kind of briefing. And Maureen, who is very familiar with civil society and some other, lots of other aspects of the current Burmese situation, and has just recently been there again, will talk a little bit about working in the society as a non-governmental foundation. She is the Soros Foundations, and then we'll also perhaps touch on the role of Aung San Suu Kyi. Somebody here is going to have to do this tonight because I think there's a bit of a time lag sometimes in the U.S. between how we picture her as the perfection of politics in Burma and how she's seen there as a practical politician evolving through some very difficult times and not always taking what many people feel are effective and acceptable stands, particularly on the minorities question and particularly on the Muslims. So we'll begin with the Ambassador.
Hey, thank you very much, Barbara, and good evening to everyone. I really appreciate the fact that the U.S. mission has gathered us here, and FPA has done a nice job. You know, it strikes me as very difficult to capture a country's 70-year history in 30 minutes. But the documentary has done a nice job highlighting some of the more dramatic moments in the course of that history. And I'm a little daunted to be surrounded by two movie stars here who did a nice job in that piece, and I look forward to hearing from them as well. Yes, in fact, I have been involved with our Burma policy for quite some time, at very different points in our relationship. In the 1990s, for 3 years, a decade ago, living inside Burma, and for the past 3 years. You can pick, I think, any of those years and find that it's always very interesting in Burma. There's no absence of interesting things there. And today is no exception. So the White House has issued a statement that we have invited President Thein Sein to visit, the president of Myanmar. That in itself is a little bit interesting. I'll get around to that in a moment. It's the first head of state visit in fact, in 47 years. 1966 was a very different time, I can tell you that, for both countries. So we won't focus too much on that Cold War period. But what we will focus on is the fact that it's very much a sign of changing times that President Thein Sein will be in Washington this weekend. It's also very interesting back in the country. Pick any day of the week, and you can find a host of challenges, a host of opportunities in Burma, and today and this week is no exception. The first cyclone of the season is barreling its way to the Bangladesh-Burma border, and perhaps could affect one region of the country that is right now perhaps the most challenged, the most sensitive, the most difficult for this government in transition to deal with. So lots happening. This truly is a new chapter in the relationship between the United States and Burma. And why is that? Well, I think you heard from some of the guests who were identified there in that film clip, including my partner, Derek Mitchell, our first ambassador in 22 years to Burma, and my predecessor as special representative. It's been a very dramatic 18 months or so, about 2 years. And it's been unprecedented. It's been surprising in both its scope and its pace. And it's been, for many, what they've wished for this country. Peaceful, and a transition lending itself in the direction of democracy, of respect for human rights, of achieving international standards. And so it's not a revolution, as you heard one of the speakers say. It is a surprising top-down led process, remarkable. In some aspects, it's actually, in fact, courageous, because there are many challenges inside the country that would speak against this kind of transition. And when I talk about the new era in the relationship, it's new for us as well, because we have responded in kind, in very disorienting fashion. I was very, very familiar with our policy of sanctions and pressure. In fact, I was one of the architects, if you will, of implementing that policy and enforcing it. And so as we see the changes there, we've experienced phenomenal change in Washington. Both are somewhat disorienting. Let's point to the significant steps that have taken place. Many of them you know, but I want to share with you what we focus on, in particular, as Barbara asked, to bring you up to date where we are now. So the president was there in November, President Obama. Very much a sign that we see this change as important, as something that needs to be strengthened, and something that's delivering results for the Burmese people. But it's very, very nascent, and I want to underscore that. We're under no illusions here. This is the beginning of what is going to be a long, difficult process. It's going to be bumpy. It's going to be uneven, in some regards predictably, in other ways surprising. And those challenges are significant, and any collection, any one of the major challenges could be the undoing of reform. At the end of the day, we assess that it's fragile and that it's not yet irreversible. But it is very important. So since the president was there, things have continued to happen in what we would assess as a positive trajectory. Increased freedoms of association and speech, commitments on political prisoners, on human rights, on non-proliferation, on good governance, on transparency, an empowered parliament that is really getting its legs in this new democracy, this new emerging democracy. All of this continues, and we encourage it, and we have responded in kind. Where we are now is very different from the broad regime of sanctions that we had at one point in time. Very broad. It was a policy of isolation. We are now much more targeted, calibrated policy is what we've said. We have opened up engagement. We've increased assistance. We have eased our sanctions. But we still have measures in place in a targeted fashion for a few reasons. One, it's a bit of an insurance policy. If there is any serious backsliding, we need the tools to reflect our concern about backsliding. We haven't seen it yet, so that's why I say it's an insurance policy. We also have a targeted series of sanctions in place because there are still some bad actors inside that country, whether it's in the economy, whether it's in the military realm, whether it's actors who are still keen to perpetuate old practices, abuse human rights, thwart reform, continue trade with North Korea of a military nature. Fortunately, it's a small number, but they are there, and we need the tools to ensure that they are not benefiting from our easing. And we want to encourage their behavior change, of course. Just a few weeks ago, this is an annual exercise, President Obama renewed our sanction authorities. It's called the National Emergency. It comes up every year. And I think it reflects a couple of things. One, we are concerned about many of these challenges we see in the country that are still there. Two, in fact, extending the authorities gives us the legal ability to put in place waivers for the existing sanctions. So it's a tool that has a number of benefits to it. At the same time, I think as a demonstration of our calibration, we terminated, in fact, under the name of the Secretary of State, John Kerry, we terminated the 1996 visa ban. That was a presidential proclamation put in place by then President Clinton. I was part of that process. Those were very different times. And that particular visa ban was very, very broad. It affected a whole range of actors in the military, in the government, state-owned enterprises, the former mass member organization, the USDA, and their family members. So we have removed that. We want to facilitate engagement. We want to have contact. We want to have travel in both directions. We still have travel restrictions in place, but in line with our calibration, they're much more narrow and targeted. So I'm going to answer, I know there's going to be a lot of questions, but let me just highlight a couple of things before I hand it back to you, Barbara. Where are our concerns? We focus on human rights. We focus on ending the chapter of political prisoners. There are still some political prisoners. Remarkably, they have released many, hundreds, over 800. There are still some left. They have in place a mechanism to review those, and we're encouraging them to bring that to fruition. We have concerns in general about human rights. We'd like to see a presence of the international community there in the form of the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, so that they can work with the government on addressing those concerns. Obviously, when we talk about national reconciliation, that elusive national unity that has seen the country at war with itself since the 1940s, this is a big ask. End conflicts, achieve peace, live in harmony. But it's very important for the country to move forward and to consolidate this transition to democracy. So we very much are encouraging peace talks and a political dialogue that gets at those root causes. We have other concerns. The difference now, with our concerns, we have a government that we can dialogue with, we can be honest and frank with each other, we can engage, and we are seeing a much more responsive institution, array of institutions, parliament, government, civil society. And that's why President Thein Sein will come this weekend and meet with President Obama to encourage this process, to talk openly about the challenges that remain and how we can work cooperatively going forward. It is the president of Myanmar coming. As a courtesy, we don't want to make the name issue an irritant. We don't want to be offensive. Our policy still remains Burma. In Washington, our official policy, but we are going to be courteous because these are guests, and President Thein Sein will be a guest at the White House with his entourage in Washington. And I think you will see going ahead, we will expand these courtesies so we can be kind and respectful. But for a variety of reasons, maybe we can come around to the policy will remain Burma for the foreseeable future. Why don't we end it there, Barbara, and we'll talk more. Thank you.
Francis, and one other thing that you might want to consider adding is the fit. What do the Burmese need in terms of business investment and investment in almost everything? And what's the American interest? And, you know, a little bit about that if you have time. But go ahead with your whatever you want. She is going to Burma tonight, right? So we thank her for making the effort to come here, you know, sort of between planes. Go ahead.
So Barbara, thank you and the Foreign Policy Association for including me in this study. I think it's very worthwhile. I appreciate it. And nice to be here with Peggy Carey, a friend from long ago. And, you know, I used to work in this building, 93, 94, although it wasn't as nice as it is now. So it's quite nice to be here for that reason as well. I want to tell you about a question that was posed to me in Santa Fe a month ago when I was part of a panel presentation on Burma. Someone said, 10 years from now, what do you think is going to happen? Well, I've been working Burma, Myanmar for 20 years now. I knew Patrick when he was desk officer. I knew Maureen back then. So I think I know pretty much everybody that knows the work of this issue. You can correct me, okay? But I don't think there was anyone who 2 or 3 years ago would have said what's happening in Myanmar now would have been happening. So the idea of projecting where it's going to be 10 years from now, forget about it. You know, people get paid the big bucks at RAND to do that. But so right now it's very interesting, and and we should watch it, and we should also question, you know, how much relevance the U.S. has in this process. in my 7 to 8 minutes, it's going to be a very impressionistic approach. So took some notes and just wanted to flag some things for you to think about, and in the Q&A we can go into more detail. But there are many legacies that Myanmar has. There's the colonial legacy, there's the ethnic struggles. Was this ever really a country before? No. And the reconciliation was a problem even when Aung San was the leader of the country. There's still a sanctions overhang. And there's also, I was also, okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I was also very much involved in normalization of relations with Vietnam, and so I do comparisons and contrasts in my own mind about Vietnam. And one thing that always annoyed me or bothered me about the blanket sanctions policy that we had with respect to Vietnam, total embargo, was there were plenty of people in Vietnam, South Vietnam, who weren't lucky. They didn't get out through the boat. They didn't get out through the helicopter. And yet they were there, and they suffered through the imposition of sanctions. It was a very crude tool. And I would just have you think about, a similar situation for the Burmese people, about the impact on people of our sanctions policy. Once I was in the then Chargé's house. We didn't have an ambassador in the mid-90s, and we had, I took a group of congressional staffers there, and the Chargé, then Kent Wiedemann, who became the ambassador to Cambodia, made the point that U.S. policy is always that we help the people, no matter what the situation is with respect to the government. So I, just ask you to keep that in mind as you think about what's going on in the country, past and present. With respect to trade and investment, last July, I helped organize a group of our companies from the U.S. ASEAN Business Council to go there for the first U.S. mission. And we didn't even go to Naypyidaw, the capital. We just were in Yangon. And there were 38 or 39 companies that signed up, which is a large number given where we go in Southeast Asia. But I thought the companies were a little bit irrationally exuberant because it's going to be a long time before the safeguards that our companies need to have in place are in place. The country has incredible promise. It's very big. There are 58 million people. It's a very rich country. The people there need everything. But there are incredible challenges. There's a very basic lack of human capacity. Every enterprise you enter into, whether it's getting a visa at the embassy or arranging for a press conference or an event, it's, you just are struck about the lack of human capacity. There is no infrastructure. There is no electricity. Agriculture, which was, their claim to fame in the 50s, is in complete shambles. It can be better, but it's not. And we're not even talking about the lack of rule of law, the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability, and the lack of experience in 21st century world. All that can be dealt with, and it will be dealt with, but it's not an environment that U.S. companies necessarily do well in. American companies don't always do so well in kind of cowboy economies. Some other countries' companies do better. And so there's a reluctance to come in. And nowadays there's something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And there's personal liability if you, personal liability if you get involved in a bad transaction. So that's a real stop right there. It's a place where, it's still a place where who you know makes a difference. And you have to really do due diligence. And you have to get with a firm that can help you do the due diligence. And you cannot do investment by internet. You have to go there. and you have to be there on the ground. People can't just parachute in and have a couple meetings. First of all, it's not that easy to get in there, but you can't just go in and then have a meeting and then you have you have to be in it for the long haul. I mean, I agree with much of what Patrick just said. But I want to end on telling you about two personal experiences with two businesses that show you that things can be done. Back in November, when President Obama met with President Thein, one of the things that President Thein raised with the president was, establishing a national health care system for the country. I knew about that conversation, and I also knew that one of our members of the council, JPIGO, it's a world-renowned maternal health care NGO out of Johns Hopkins, was very interested in getting into Myanmar. So we followed up, and we asked if we brought JPIGO over there, would that be of interest to the government? And the government said yes. We took the JPIGO people to Naypyidaw, met with the president's assistant, who was in charge of the president. He was sort of the thinker behind the project, and he had JPIGO meet with this foundation that has been recently established. It's staffed by, headed up by a retired WHO Burman, who brought in some other retired doctors with him. They had a 7-page analysis of what the healthcare system in Myanmar needed, and asked JPIGO to come back and do an exploratory mission and set themselves up as an NGO. Long story short, JPIGO has been there 3 times. They're doing a project with the Yangon Women's Hospital and working in cooperation with GE to have training on equipment. And then they've gone into the Karen area, and this was the government's request, because they said the Karens came on early in the reconciliation process, but they got nothing to show for it. So they wanted to have some maternal and health care projects developed there, and that is underway. I brought a couple of explanations of where they are and where they're going, and it's a real success story. Second story I want to tell you is about Facebook. When the attacks on the Muslims happened in Metila, how do you pronounce it? Metila. The government, the president's office, asked a Burman American colleague of mine, who's a member of the council, also has opened up the Deloitte office there, for help in figuring out how to reach out to Facebook because there were several Facebook placements that were inciting people to riot. And there were some people in the government who their instinct was just to shut the whole internet down. That was their instinct. And instead of that, they reached out through us to reach out to Facebook. Facebook then went through a discussion with explain how if you fill out their forms and deal with them, they will pull down the bad postings. And at the end of the day, the government decided not to ask for the postings to be pulled down because they didn't want to send out a message that they were, anti-free speech. But the point is that they reached out and asked for help. This is, a whole new day. Never, even the Vietnamese don't do this. They asked for help and went through the whole thing. And the president is actually going to visit the Facebook office in Washington on Monday, and he's going to do a live town hall meeting with Burmese worldwide on Facebook Live. So in conclusion, I live in Georgia now, so I'd like to cite a fellow Georgian, Ted Turner, who once said, lead, follow, or get out of the way. And I think that's what we should be doing with respect to Myanmar.
Maureen, I'm going to keep it very short so we can have questions.
Okay, and everyone who deals now with the people of Burma, Myanmar, always say, as you have said to me in the past, Francis, many times, what potential they have. You talked about the lack of human resources, developed human resources, and so on, human development in the UN terms. But I met kids at the American Center who were either surfing the web for a college scholarship, or were teaching themselves English, or they're getting DVDs because they think this is how they're going to get jobs when all these companies that they hope are coming. So this is not, I don't want to say a classic developing country. This is a country that needs to be reawakened and redeveloped. And so the human resources are interesting. And Maureen would certainly know a lot about working with the Burmese at the grassroots or at the neighborhood level also, as well as in the human rights and civil society organizations.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to quickly give you an example of what we're doing now. But first I want to tell Francis that don't worry about the 10 years ahead to see what's going to happen, because there are warring fortune tellers right now. And one of them wrote up in one of the Burmese newspapers. He's talking about the president. He doesn't mention names, but he says, if the president pays attention to his health and continues to be healthy, he will sure continue to rule the kingdom in 2015. So you heard it from here first. But I believe the other warring fortune teller is saying something else. So that's part of the problem. So I was telling Barbara earlier in the little green room that when I give a talk, now and then on Burma, I've been calling my talks about Burma and the government from pariah to poster child, because everybody loves this transitioning Burma, the top-down democracy thing. So, but then I think of myself as from pariah for them. So from blacklist to FRC, if you know what FRC is, that's the foreign residence certificate that they gave me like that after 20 years of blacklist. So go figure. But I think that sort of shows either that the changes are happening so fast that they can't keep up with it, or there's also a lack of human capacity in the bureaucracy, or there's, the laws are not clear. In any case, we're taking advantage of it because we've, my foundation for 20 years, I could say we've been sort of fighting them, sort of, but at the same time, we've always kept our lines across, maybe like the State Department. We've always kept our lines across to the government here, based in New York, and also the Burmese government based in New York and Washington. No, I'm talking about the Burmese government. I mean, we don't publicize it. Now it can be told, but we didn't go around publicizing because some of our grantees would probably hit us. But I remember one former ambassador calling us and saying, "Hey, what's happening in Burma?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, what's happening in Burma?" We have to tell him what's happening in Burma because it's pretty divided. The divided meaning they get their information from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is different from the executive, which is different from those in the know, cronies, whatever. So it's been actually quite exciting for many years before the changes started happening. We, a little over a year now, after the blacklist stopped, I went there and we got the world's fastest MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, to establish an office because my boss had met the executives the few months before when he went on his first trip to Burma. And he said, the president said, "Why don't you open an office?" But I think my boss probably said, "Can we open an office?" And he said, "Sure." So we opened an office. And there were some sort of rules about you have to have the office here in this ex-official building. So we signed an MOU that said, "Yep, that's our official address, but we're going to have our own office in addition." So there was nothing, nobody said anything. And the kind of things that we said we were going to work on, you could get it from our website, access to justice, media, transparency, a whole string of things. It could be that they also wanted this MOU with us for whatever reason. I think to show that, look, we have changed, and here's, the devils are now here, and we've given them an MOU. So, but it's been very interesting. We've had access, especially in I would say, the sectors that need a lot of help, and we have a lot of experience in education and public health. And media, we thought, we've been funding the exile media for a long time. We thought, oh, that might be a problem with all these exile media, our exile media used to criticize them, but they've all been given MOUs too, or business licenses, and they're all back, and they all have offices in Rangoon. And one of them just went back in and is not leaving. I mean, the others still have a little office in the border. So I'm just going to throw out a couple of challenges. You know, I'm not going to argue about sanctions, not sanctions, but regardless, even if the sanctions, if everything were perfect, no one's going to come to invest in Burma really until they fix the laws. They have a banking system. They have a ways to regulate what the law says. They're not, you know, so all this mad gold rush is actually kind of funny because I don't think anything serious is really going to happen until they do those things. We're particularly concerned because we see the gap growing from the viewpoint of the civil society from the bottom up. But we're also quite happy to see that the exiles, our grantees say, the ones, especially the young people who fled in '88, a lot of them are going back, including, Francis mentioned the dissidents. Really, almost every major dissident has been back. And some of them have gone back to stay, and we were concerned about how they would reintegrate, considering that they had some privileges that the other people who remained did not. But I think in a way they can be a bridge, and of course we have to help them to be a bridge, because that's why we're there. I just want to give one example, then I'm going to stop because I really like questions. I'm worried about that Facebook. If I were President Thein Sein, I wouldn't go and do a big town hall meeting in Facebook office, just because, well, I hope it's controlled, because there's a big concern of ours is also the sectarian violence. And Facebook, Burmese Facebook, which I don't think the English-speaking Facebook officials even knew about, but it's filled with really, really awful, not only instigation, but really bad racism and virulent hatred there. So Zagana, who you saw at the back of the bald-headed famous comedian who was released, and you saw it in the clip. When I was there, just came back about a month ago, I went to one of his first huge concert that he gave in this big field, and it was just a variety show and lots of comedy, of course, and he took on everybody. In fact, I was sitting with some people who said, I'm not quite sure, I think he's gone too far. So when I saw the clip of the speaker, Shui Man, coming ahead, he was following the guy carrying the little, whatever it is, the band, that stick, not stick, what is it called? Well, anyway, ceremonial thing, or he went, that was one of the funniest episodes that Zagana had. He dressed himself up, of course, as the speaker, but what he didn't know until he turned around, it was very scatological, by the way, but it's all in Burmese, is his longi had a big hole in it in the back. And so he took on Suu Kyi, he took on Shui Man, he took on Tan Shui's wife. I mean, that was pretty, courageous, but he did. And nothing's happened to him. He's still there, and all the jokes were extremely funny. So I'm going to stop now just because, one more thing I'm worried about, Francis, you must be too, and you too, is I'm worried about the little capacities. Sometimes you think there are 30 people who are really capable, and we've already lost one of them, as you know. Nehru dropped dead of a heart attack 2 years ago. I'm not saying, but it's a combination of stress and burnout and not the nature of bad cuisine too, by the way. I don't want to say bad Burmese cuisine, but yeah, quality of the oils a little bit too much. So one of our big capable people that happens to be one of our grantees, I actually forced him to have a complete physical checkup while he was here, just because we just didn't want to take a chance. You can't lose if you lost, a couple, and I tell him that straight away too. We lost just a couple of them. That'd be it for the transition. So, thank you.
Okay, well, we're going to take questions. I should just say that this is a very serious story, but the elements of the bizarre are everywhere. As she's describing the pantomime of the comic, if you looked at that list, because I was fighting for a visa up until practically the day I left, Francis was helping me in the fall, and I actually went through that list of the first whatever. It came out in bits, right? Like 4,000 names, 5,000 names, 6,000, the blacklist. And it was crazy. I mean, it had no, I mean, it wasn't, I mean, the whole universities were banned. A lot of dead people. A lot of people who, I mean, just, it was just crazy. And some of these things, today I read that Ken Wint, the former military intelligence chief, has opened an art gallery. So, I mean, it's endearing, but it's fascinating.